Morning all. Morning all. I wanted to share something about something I learned or discovered or got reminded about over the weekend last week. This is the law of love. In the Bible, there's a story of Pharisees coming to Jesus, and it's found in John. Matthew. Matthew is one of the best records of it. Matthew chapter 22 and 37, 35, 34. Morning all. I wanted to read something that reminded me of the principle of love. And we talk about love these days, and everyone seems to have a different definition of love, and love is all mixed up. And love now, then you have all pride, and you have all this tolerance movement, and you have all this inclusive movement, and all these kinds of things that are taking over the world right now. And I wanted us to return back to the basis and the meaning of love. And one of the best stories in the Bible is about the Pharisees coming to Jesus, and it's found in Matthew 22. And the Pharisees come to Jesus, and they ask Jesus this question in Matthew chapter 22. Teacher, which is the great commandment in the law? In other words, they were asking, what's the greatest commandment? Out of all the laws that they ask Jesus, what's the greatest commandment? And Jesus says this to them, and I'll read this. He says, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the great and first commandment. And the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments depend all the law and the prophets. Now, there's three things that I wanted to share about this answer that Jesus gave. Number one is this: the number one kind of love that we should have, the first greatest commandment, is loving God. It's loving God trumps all our laws about interacting with anyone or anything. It's number one. And loving God becomes the basis for us trusting Him, for us obeying Him, and for us finding more about Him, discovering more about Him. If there's no love for God, there'll be no pursuit of God, pursuit for God. And so Christ is telling us this because he wants God to be our number one pursuit in life. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and mind and soul. And so if God isn't our love, it doesn't become our pursuit. We don't pursue Him if we don't love Him or we don't desire Him. But also loving God becomes the basis for us seeking to point Him out to other people, and so they can love Him and have a relationship with Him. And it's interesting, the second point is this: loving others is considered second class or second law, or it's a inferior law. So if you had a hierarchy of laws that we have in Papua New Guinea, we call the hierarchy of laws, that you have constitution number one, organic law number two, acts of parliament number three. Loving God is a constitutional law, and then loving each other is a act of parliament or an organic law. It's an inferior law. So we have these laws that Christ is giving us and saying, your number one law is that you love God. And so He makes that our requirement. And then number two, and the thing I find about number two is this: our love for each other can be so confusing if it is outside of God. You have laws that not laws, but you have love for each other, and then we all debate. We can all have a debate about what love really means. Jesus comes and says, well, all our love, which is all confused. And now we're living in the age where you have things like the thou shalt not offend gospel, you have the inclusivity gospel, you have the pride gospel, and you have all these things, and they all are preaching love. But then we end up disagreeing with each other, even within those spaces of inclusivity. You can see how inclusivity actually excludes people who disagree with the idea of inclusivity, or to a certain modification. For example, Israel Folau, his comments about the LGBTQ community got him banned from playing rugby in Australia, and people sought him out as love. And he says, no, in his Christian worldview, loving people means telling people the truth. But in the worldly definition of love, loving people means let them express themselves and live their lives and let them go and do sin however they please, right? Anyway, so that's the thing about human love. If human love is just based on human reason, human feelings, then we're all over the place. We'll end up just being love one way, the other, and it's all fine. And then when they get to a place where our love conflicts, like I love you this way and you love me this way, and our love, you see my love as hate and I see your love as unloving, then there's no definition. And so Jesus is saying all love must be based on our love to God. If there is love outside of God or loving God, it becomes humanistic, subjective, and it will fail in the end. So these are the first two things that come up in Jesus' statement. The last thing I wanted to share is this. He says in verse 40 of chapter 22, all the law hangs on these two. I read from the ESV, but the other version, it says all laws hang on these two. It's true that all the laws hang on this commandment of loving God and loving each other in the way Jesus or God designs love to be. I wanted to share this thing from, now we all know it's kind of settled that common law, which is the law of Papua New Guinea, is common law, and all the other Western law systems came out from Christian principles, right? But I always love this story about Jesus' exchange with the Pharisees, because there's a case in law, in legal studies, that all lawyers are familiar with, and it's the law that gave us the clear guideline to negligence. And the case law is this. It's a 1932 case. It's called Donahue and Stevenson. 1932 case. This was the judgment issued by the House of Lords, the English House of Lords, and it's a binding law in Papua New Guinea, so all lawyers know this. But in that case, the facts are that two ladies went into a cafe, bought a drink, and then one of the ladies drank the drink, the friend of the lady who actually purchased the drink, and then she found a dead snail after drinking half the contents of that bottle of drink. And then she sued the manufacturers. And the first defense that the manufacturers had was she didn't buy the drink, therefore she had no contract, and so they could escape liability because there was no contract. But then there was this principle of law that came out, and Lord Atkin wrote the judgment of the House of Lords, who ruled in her favor and said that there was negligence on part of the manufacturer, even though there was no contract between her and the manufacturer. The manufacturer was liable because they were negligent. And this is how he summarizes the decision, or this is the decision, the piece of the judgment that has become the principle of negligence, the tort of negligence, which is when someone fails in their duty of care towards you, you can take them to court. And so this is what Donahue and Stevenson, in particular Lord Atkins, said in his judgment. And this is one of the key things that he said. Let me just pull it up. And to me, he almost kind of extracts the principle of love your neighbor from Jesus' statement in Matthew chapter 22 and all his other statements. Let me find it. Okay, so he says this, and I quote, "The rule that you are to love your neighbor becomes in law, you must not injure your neighbor. And the lawyer's question, who is my neighbor, receives a restricted reply. You must take reasonable care to avoid acts or omission which you can reasonably foresee would be likely to injure your neighbor. Who then in law is my neighbor? The answer seems to be persons who are so closely and directly affected by my act that I ought reasonably to have them in contemplation as being so affected when I am directing my mind to the acts or omissions which are called in question." And so this is Lord Atkins now, I think, in the legal sense, giving effect to what Jesus was saying in Matthew chapter 22 when he says, love your neighbor as you would love yourself. He's saying, have care, due care for people. If you're not aware of your actions and you're carrying out these actions, but you're not having them in mind, then your actions result in them being injured by your actions, or a direct result of your actions, then you become liable to those persons. And that's the definition, according to Lord Atkin in this case, the definition of neighbor. In the story that Jesus made regarding the Good Samaritan, when the question was asked, who's my neighbor? He gave the parable of the Good Samaritan, and then he asked people, who was the neighbor in this instance? And he says, the person who helped. And so if you take Jesus' comments and then you take Lord Atkin's description of the neighbor here, these words by Jesus, all law hangs on these two, becomes a reality, because this is the principle of negligence. And for all of us right now, if you take an action and a person is injured by it and they take you to court, then you become potentially liable for negligence if the court sees that you should have reasonably foreseen that person would be affected by your actions, and then the court will hold you liable on that basis, might. And so this principle of love your neighbor as you love yourself, it hangs on that who's my neighbor principle. And who's my neighbor is a question that was asked to Jesus, and Jesus, his summary of the entire laws of God is, you shall love your neighbor as you love yourself. And so now if you go to court and you charge someone, or you take someone to court for negligence, it's most likely that your lawyers will pull up Donahue versus Stevenson and argue on that principle, plus all the other case law that has been developed based on this principle, developed by Lord Atkin. So anyway, I just wanted to share this because love hangs on these two laws, and all our interactions hang on these two. So first thing from Jesus' statement is loving God first and then love each other. If there is no vertical love, all our horizontal love is meaningless. We are just firing blanks at each other, and we're not really loving. Our love is subjective. You can feel love, you can fall in love and then fall out of love, and then you can love by inclusivity, or you can love by telling the truth and then thus offending people, because truth is by nature offensive. So if people are saying love but don't offend, or if you offend, you are not loving, you are hating, that's coming from the basis of there being no foundation for love. And so I guess my point to everyone is, just when you think about love, is your love hanging on a vacuum, or is it hanging in midair? There's no foundation for it. Or is it based on a love for God first? And apart from love for God, all our love is meaningless. That's the bottom line. All right, have a nice day.